I want to start on time because we have a lot of ground to cover. We have some very interesting panelists. I'd just like to introduce our moderator, Ari Fitzgerald, who's a partner in Washington, D.C. office of Hogan Lovells. He is a very experienced lawyer. His practice is in spectrum issues like wireless and satellite, international communications, and internet issues. Ari actually joined the practice after serving as a legal advisor to former FCC Chairman Bill Kennard. And he actually also worked as deputy chief of the International Bureau at the FCC. And then experience before that at the DOJ, and also counsel to Senator Bill Bradley. So please join me in welcoming panel number 2.
By introducing our panel. The purpose of this panel is really to sort of get a little bit more granular and talk about the interference issues that operators are experiencing, and we're very fortunate to have with us representatives of some operators and people who work with operators. And so we're going to drill down a little bit. We're going to talk about the noise problems that they are encountering, how they find out about these issues, what they worry most about, what they're doing about interference, and what suggestions they might have for government to improve the situation. I'm going to start introducing from my left. Lynn Claudy is Senior Vice President for Technology at the National Association of Broadcasters. And to Lynn's left is Tom Dombrowsky, an engineering consultant at Wiley Rein, who does a lot of work with wireless operators. To Tom's left is Mark Gibson, who's Senior Director of Business Development at Comsearch and works a lot with companies that are coordinating fixed microwave systems, among other things. And then to Mark's left is Matt Larsen, the founder of Vistabeam, a WISP serving many rural communities in Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And then to Matt's left is Steve Sharkey, the Director, Chief Engineering and Technology Policy at T-Mobile Government Affairs. So this is we're going to just sort of dive into the questions, and I'm going to direct my first question actually to Lynn, if it's okay, and just ask Lynn to talk a little bit about some of the interference issues that the broadcasters have been encountering lately. And then we'll have some people sort of respond.
Well, I think broadcasting probably is not unlike other industries in that the world has changed. Certainly for spectrum users, it's just changed radically in broadcasting initially as a result from the transition from analog to digital broadcasting, where all rules about what was interference and what did you really have to worry about shifted. And now broadcasting, which still operates a pretty good swath of spectrum, 294 megahertz in the VHF and UHF bands, is highly sought after by other people to either reallocate some of it for other use, or to have shared use where it isn't used in the so-called white spaces. So it's a whole new world in terms of how do you continue to operate, and in the digital mode, things that you used to put up with in analog. If you saw some impulse noise on the screen in old analog TV on channel 2, and it just had kind of some speckles on the image, it wasn't that big a deal, especially compared to you saw ghosts. You saw multiple images. Now kids can ask their parents, "Daddy, what's a ghost?" It doesn't exist anymore. But those speckles that were maybe not as pernicious in effect now are real system killers for a digital system. So you care more about things like impulse noise that you didn't before. I think we'll probably go through some specific issues as the panel goes on, but if there's a theme for broadcasting, it's that what you worry about in interference and what you worry about in noise floor is a moving target, and everybody's a part of that, and everybody has their own view on it, and everyone has their own business to operate. So trying to, in a service like broadcasting, which was mature and where there was for many years some kind of equilibrium with other services, now is kind of in turmoil, and a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about who should get what and what kind of protection is valid and how much is too much, and what is the highest and best use of spectrum is a very live topic.
Yeah, we're going to, as Lynn mentioned, we're going to sort of get into specifics later on in the panel, but I want to now turn to Steve, if it's okay, another operator, or at least providing another perspective. And Steve, can you talk a little bit first about some of the experiences T-Mobile had? T-Mobile purchased AWS spectrum a few years ago, paid billions of dollars for it. Pierre has mentioned how the wireless operators have spent billions of dollars for their licenses. And it was spectrum that had been used by the federal government prior to the FCC putting it up for auction. Could you talk about some of the, and the FCC was aware of the prior uses, obviously, and there was a lot of discussion in the preceding record about relocating the government users. Can you talk about kind of what T-Mobile's experience was as it started trying to deploy in that band?
Yeah. And so the federal government uses that were in the AWS band were a mix of, a wide mix of uses, but some of the primary issues were around Department of Defense use and Department of Justice use. And so there was and it's kind of a mix that was scattered around the country. And so there was a lot of work to work with those agencies to, as they were clearing the spectrum, that we were being allowed to use the spectrum. We were doing it on an area by area basis, right? You would go in, you'd say, look, we want to build our network here, and look at what the systems are, and try and get them to clear out of that area. And I think for the most part it worked pretty well, despite hiccups along the way. I think one of the biggest issues we ran into was the difficulty of the federal agencies to know what they had actually deployed and what they had out there and controlling their systems. So, we would go into an area and they would say, okay, we've cleared out all the systems in this area, and you would build a network and turn it on and find interference, and you'd find signals that were still there, and the kind of central coordinating body would say, no, we've shut everything off. So you actually had to go in, and we would have our guys triangulate on interfering signals, find out where they are, and take pictures of transmitters and give them signatures of signals and go back and say, look, here's what we find. And then they would usually just take it, and in a day or two it would just disappear. So, and frankly, that still pops up today. Fairly recently we had, so there's really no, other than a couple of areas, there's supposed to be no government use left in that band. But we recently had an incident where a law enforcement agency took some old equipment that was laying around, took it off the shelf and deployed it and turned it on and shut down part of our network. So, and I think these kinds of problems come up as we're doing transitions, and it gets to be a more congested environment, and we're looking at something even more complex in the next what's referred to as the AWS 3 band, which will be immediately above this AWS 1 spectrum that we're operating in right now. And there's an even wider mix of federal agencies, and there'll be more sharing. There'll be more of the DoD systems and more of the federal systems that'll remain in the band. So we actually have to do a lot of coordination around certain areas, and look at both making sure that our systems won't interfere with them and looking at the interference that comes into us. But I think one of the things that we're having to do is look at what is the level of impairment that we can live with. So obviously if it shuts down our network in an area, that's something that's not acceptable. But we are looking at in some of these sharing scenarios, can we accept an increased level of noise that our system can adjust to and live with, just so that we can get some use of that spectrum closer in areas where we wouldn't, better to have some use rather than none, and hopefully we can eventually work it getting it cleaner and cleaner. But there is more of more of those kinds of discussions going on as well.
Yeah, I want to also just ask Mark, as someone who works quite a bit with entities that are interested in deploying fixed microwave, and under a regime that the FCC is pretty much, where the FCC is essentially sort of outsourced most of the spectrum management work to the private sector, the coordinators, and Mark's company does a lot of those coordinations. Can you talk, Mark, a little bit about kind of, what your experience is, where you see, what kinds of problems you see, and what are usually the causes of the problems?
Yeah, certainly, Ari. So Ari is referring to the typical FCC Part 101 microwave frequency coordination, which has actually been around since the 70s. I think the original order was from like 1973 or 72 or something like that. So it's been there a long time. And what they did in the order, or in the rules, is the rules just mandate frequency coordination before deployment. Now, they had also was done in Part 90, but the Part 101 is slightly different insofar as sort of a go and return. In other words, when an entity wants to deploy a microwave system, they actually have to do a frequency coordination, and they have to, as part of their license, prove that they did the frequency coordination and that it was successful, and the success is in the return. And so included with the license application is something called a supplemental showing, and that showing indicates that the frequency coordination was, quote, successful. And so what we do in the frequency coordination process is we notify other frequency coordinators, or generally the community, the frequency coordinators acting on behalf of other microwave licensees, of what a typical licensee wants to do. And that process usually takes 30 days. That's the general mandate in the rule. And so we send it out, send the information out. Others will run the analysis and determine whether they see any problems with that. And if they do, they get back in touch with us, and we do the frequency coordination. And it's a lot of it is, especially in these days, there's a lot of back and forth that happens. And so the frequency coordinators have tools at their disposal to mitigate potential for interference, and we call it potential for harmful interference. And so once we get past that, supplemental showing accompanies the license application. It's filed, and for all intents and purposes, 99% of the time, everything works fine. These are also put on public notice. And so what can happen is, where the process can break a couple times, is where we will monitor those public notices on behalf of our customers. And if we see somebody come up on public notice that didn't do the coordination, we will flag that. And we will then, on behalf of our customer, contact either the coordinator or the licensee and say, hold on, you haven't filed with your coordination, what up? And so we'll begin a back and forth discussion. And again, 90% of the time there was some sort of a clerical problem. So the 1% of the 1% of the time when something happens, we will contact our customer, and there will be a petition to deny filed on behalf of the whatever licensee, where they notice that someone has tried to file a license where the frequency coordination wasn't done. So that's all that stuff that happens before something should actually be turned on. When something does get turned on, and interference could again, in the rare case, happen in microwave, then we'll get contacted, and somebody will say, I'm getting interference. And then we try to run through sort of a phone screen as, what does interference really mean? Are you really getting interference? And so we'll go through that. And then if we can't really troubleshoot it over the phone, and sometimes it can be as simple as, as the sign there says, move your cell phone from the microphone, which is a plaque that says that right there, which I found interesting sitting here. But nonetheless, so we'll go through a list of troubleshoots, and then we'll do a truck roll and send people out and actually try to mitigate, or I find the problem and identify mitigation parameters. And again, it's rare, but we'll run into certain situations. We'll find, people are out there doing things they probably shouldn't. We've got our case files that are full of that sort of thing, and so does the commission. But that's in a nutshell how the process works. And it's been working, like I said, fairly well for the last, however many years. 40 years? Yeah, 40 years. Wow.
I want to get a dialogue going among the panelists about kind of whether the approach that's been working for 40 years, the Part 101 approach, can be replicated either for bands where there has been where there have been some sort of high-profile examples of interference, or whether that's a special sort of situation. But I wanted to turn to Matt for a second, just ask him, as someone who basically works with unlicensed spectrum. I think most of your all your services are provided over unlicensed.
Yeah.
Kind of how you deal with, you're actually, you have no rights to be free from interference, so you've got to sort of, you know, be robust enough to sort of withstand it, but at the same time, if you're causing interference to an authorized user, you have to turn off. So how do you kind of navigate those issues as an unlicensed operator?
Well, I can tell you the two main interference sources that I've experienced on my network are lightning and FM stations. Lightning blows up radios, and FM stations cause a problem with the Ethernet wire that runs down the tower. So I think you kind of touched on it, that unlicensed systems are basically built from the start to kind of be robust and more survivable. And then the other thing that helps a lot is that a lot of them take advantage of being software-defined radios, having some spectral flexibility. So we have the ability to go in and change channels and kind of work around, along with all the other RF tricks, you know, sectorization, polarization, reducing the diameter of cells, doing small cells. Those are all things a lot of the fixed wireless operators have been doing. A big part of it, I think, is also the deployment methodology. By using a high gain antenna on the customer side, enables us to maintain a lot higher signal to noise ratio, which means we're able to maintain pretty good reliability as far as the quality of the connection and the speed. So, you know, for the most part, we've had to go out and deal with ourselves for the most part. There's always going to be somebody, you'll hear stories about, this is one of my favorites, was a guy that his internet wasn't working very well, and he finally figured out that the teenage girl next door was on her cordless phone, and then his internet wasn't working well. We were a little bit more concerned about the fact that he was observing the neighbor's phone. But those kind of situations are actually few and far between anymore, because as the fixed systems have gotten better, we've had less issues with interference from consumer sources. So really a lot of it is just the fact that there are places where we run out of unlicensed spectrum to work with. Mm-hmm. The systems degrade pretty gracefully to the point where you can get down to where you're at 20 or 30% of actually getting packets through is where you really start to see issues. And the thing that would really improve our business model would be to have a little bit more of unlicensed spectrum, or lightly licensed spectrum, that we could at least have some, maybe not necessarily exclusive rights to it, but maybe a little bit more coordinated and shared approach where multiple providers could coordinate their efforts so that they don't step on each other. Right now it's kind of a combination of the honor system and mutually assured destruction. So surprisingly enough, it actually has worked out fairly well, and the biggest thing is, as long as we can keep Netflix working to our customers, you know, it's all good.
It's interesting that you know, an operator that is relying exclusively on unlicensed is now talking about possibly moving to a model that's a little bit more command and control in order to sort of you know, ensure reliability. Tom, I wanted you just to talk a little bit about, I know you've been involved in, there've been a lot of issues starting with Light Squared and now sort of flowing into other, involving GPS and GPS receivers, and their arguments or statements that not only are they, not only would operations, well, we all know about the Light Squared situation, but recently the GPS industry has also made arguments that the noise floor, increases in the noise floor also need to be taken into account as the FCC considers imposing out-of-band emission limits for other bands like AWS-3. I think they imposed a stricter out-of-band emission limit for AWS-4, if I remember correctly. So could you talk about, I mean, this is, you know, this is these are the types of arguments that could, well, have impact wireless operators that would in some ways reduce the flexibility that they would have to operate.
Yeah, no, I thought the first panel had a pretty good discussion of some of those issues. I mean, they talked about the pristine GPS band, and they'd really like to, at least on the limits they talk about, sometimes have things even below the noise floor in terms of the power coming out of other devices. And because of the light squared sort of interaction that went on, where light squared was right next to GPS, and there was a lot of concern from the GPS community, and they got very fired up about it and had some pretty good success there. They've now felt empowered to sort of come after other bands. The AWS 4 band, when Dish tried to move to a more terrestrial use of the AWS 4 spectrum that was traditionally satellite spectrum. We've just seen it in the AWS 3 spectrum. And we're talking about hundreds of megahertz away in terms of locations. We're talking about not your neighbor, we're talking about the guy in Philadelphia complaining about the guy in Baltimore. So it's really a huge creep that we're starting to see from the GPS folks, and we're seeing it from other guys too. I don't want to just pick on GPS certainly here, but the bottom line is we're getting a much more congested spectrum environment, and folks that are the incumbents don't want anybody sort of treading on their spectrum, and especially in the satellite context. So if you imagine GPS, we're talking thousands of miles up in space communicating down to Earth, so they have very weak signals at the Earth level. And they're very concerned about keeping that sort of link margin for themselves very, very clear and free from even a nearby low-powered terrestrial use, which is much higher powered when compared to the signal coming from space. So it's a growing issue, and I think the FCC has had a tough job to sort of balance those issues, but I think also from the sort of other folks using the spectrum, there is some concern there that we're having sort of mission creep from GPS into other bands.
Well, every time these issues come up when sort of incumbent services start complaining, first, services that were deployed, earlier start complaining about potential for interference from new services. Issue comes up where some people call for receiver standards. I'd be interested in what the panelists have to say about whether, and the last time the FCC tried to sort of move in that direction, there was a lot of opposition, mainly from many of the incumbents. I'd be interested in what the panelists have to say. Have we gotten to a point now where these issues require, in order to be adequately resolved, require the FCC to take a look at receiver standards?
Go first. I mean, I'm not the lawyer. I don't know if we even have a lawyer other than Ari on the panel, but
no, that's good.
There's always
we don't need any more lawyers.
There's always the issue of sort of jurisdiction the FCC has over receivers. So we'll just push past that and assume that we're not talking about jurisdictional issues. And I think what we've found in the past 20 or 30 years is that the FCC tries to keep up with the technical issues. But for example, cellular, when we first got cellular adopted, one analog standard, the FCC said, this is exactly how you'll design your analog cellular system. And that was pretty successful. However, what they also found out when they went to digital, that they were not capable of keeping up with sort of the technology and the standards. So at a lot of levels, it makes a lot of sense, to the extent you can empower it, is to have the commercial industry look at what sort of standards that will work and keep everybody working very productively and getting the most use out of the spectrum. So that's my 2 cents.
Steve, and from in reality, are operators now, making sure, I mean, are they focusing a lot more on their receivers than they may have a few years ago because of the additional?
Yeah, and I think one of the difficulties on this problem is it's not just a receiver issue, it's a whole network issue, right? Yeah. So it's it's a balance of, what you're trying, are you trying to receive really low-level signals, and that's causing problem because your network just isn't built robustly enough. So it's, I don't know that the FCC, and actually I think there's a lot of support for the FCC to do something on receiver performance in general. And I mean, the solution is different depending on the system that you're looking at. I always go back to one of the examples where they were dealing with interference in the 800 megahertz band, Nextel interference to public safety. And as part of that solution, they defined the environment that you need to be able to operate in. So to the extent that public safety was going to complain about interference, they could complain about it if their network met certain criteria. So if you had a certain desired signal level and a receiver that performed to a certain level and still received interference, then you could complain that there was a real interference problem, and so, you could approach the guy causing it and they would have to do something. If not, then it's up to public safety to improve their system, to put more signal on the ground, put another tower up, buy improved receivers. So that's, I think that's an area where it was a good balance of looking at the full network and, how all those pieces fit together. And that, that may not always work in every case. I think the incentives, in some of these cases where a provider controls both the receivers that are being deployed as well as the network being deployed, there's a little bit more control about on both ends. In other services, broadcast services or other consumer services where a consumer is going out and buying a receiver that's really detached from the signal provider, there's a lot less control and it becomes a more difficult problem. So I think there's definitely a desire for the FCC to look at what's the right approach as it's making new regulations to ensure that we're not having to create, everybody else isn't having to create a quiet zone just to protect a system that doesn't operate up to a level that it should be reasonably expected to operate to. And, and I think that's a balance too of, to Tom's point, the FCC, it's very difficult for them to say, here's what we think the state of the art is on receivers right now, and that, that's what everybody should be doing. It's got to be a little bit more industry driven or, network.
Mark?
Yeah, just wanted to comment on the whole concept. I mean, the concept that is fairly new. The harm claim threshold is a fascinating concept. It has a predecessor. Say again?
Pierre.
Yeah, Pierre. Yeah, has a predecessor, which died a slow death, and that was the interference temperature. Actually, it was a rather quick death, but and that concept's a little better baked than interference temperature. But I wasn't going to comment on the issue of rate receiver standards. Is somewhat difficult to pin down. There are new bands where sharing can be affected much better with receiver standards where there is no legacy equipment. But when you're talking about bands where there is a profusion of legacy equipment, you may be able to set a receiver standard today that in 50 years might be applicable. And I'm thinking, just because it came up in the panel on Friday at the commission, the unlicensed WMTS, not unlicensed, the WMTS band and the desire to share with unlicensed. They're over, in the 608 meg band, over 100, almost 200,000 devices that I know, and some of them are very old. Just because hospitals tend to repurpose equipment, that's in everybody's best interest because it may sound bad, but it keeps costs down. And once the thing may go through the washing machine and they get a new one, but bottom line is they may have to, and it doesn't go through the washing machine with a patient on it. They remove it from the patient and it gets wrapped up in the linens. But the issue is, to go back into that service and then try to replace the radios, and these aren't really these are the distributed antenna systems, is very costly. And would have a profound impact on the system, on the users, just to affect sharing with the new service. So, receiver standards have a place, but in spectrum that's occupied by legacy operators, unless the commission came back and said, from this date forward you will not get protection, and there will be public interest issues with that, it may not work, as people might hope for it to.
Lynn, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I think there's a couple things that we know that are almost self-obvious. The first being, if you're going to regulate interference, you have to take into account, if you're going to do an effective job of it, both out-of-band emissions from the transmitter and receiver performance out-of-band. There's no question it's a system problem. By the same token, we also know that trying to regulate receivers is pretty much a non-starter in the sophisticated legal and industry conversations that take place. So, fortunately, and credit to Silicon Flatirons here, and Pierre DeVries and others that have kind of made an abstraction by talking about interference limits, meaning describe the environment in which your device will have to work, and if you want to make a device that will work, you'll have to take due note of this, and you will have no claim for interference if you don't operate in that environment. And in a way, that's kind of describing receiver standards without without
Using
saying
that
it.
term.
And it gets around some of the institutional problems and the legal problems. It's especially effective, I think, in the case of what Dale would call the decoupled receivers, which is, for instance, television industry, where the television broadcaster has absolutely no connection with the devices that are going to receive their signal. So the people that make those devices march to a different drum or do what they will do. And the idea of having some guidance towards what they should do without telling them what they have to do is perhaps a very practical template for the future.
Dale?
Yeah, if I could just add a little comment there too. The nice thing about it, it allows the design engineer to work in that environment. Maybe you implied this, but you know, there's different trade-offs that you can make within the device itself. And so the government's not dictating as much of the detail. The other advantage, I think, is if there is a large installed base out there, one of the things you can start out with a fairly loose and then give people notice that, okay, we realize that you're financially, you have troubles and so forth, so therefore we'll give you 10 years, but we'll ratchet it down so that as you naturally replace your equipment, you would replace it with the more selective equipment. So it wouldn't have an immediate impact, but when you go through your natural replacement, don't for God's sakes go back and buy the technology that got us in trouble in the first place. So I think those are two additional advantages of the harm claim threshold approach.
Yeah, do you think that, I mean, that's a really good point you make about the sort of interference harm threshold and how you could possibly transition to deal with the installed base, but given the way Washington works, how practical, I mean, you know, I know. There will always be people who come out of the woodwork and say, if you do this, you're going to harm, and you know, there's a constituency here, and we're keeping the service relatively, you know, we're offering it to them relatively inexpensively, and you're going to increase the costs. You know, again, I mean, I think transitions such as what you described, Dale, can be very helpful. But realistically, I mean, you know, how likely do you think we'd ever get something like an interference harm threshold through?
I am absolutely, totally convinced we're going to have to do something on the receiver side. And I think sort of the better we start thinking about it, the better off we will be 20 years from now. And you know, it takes political will. What we're talking about is political will here. You have the political will to do something now against, you know, some firms or whatever, or some very influential groups that want to save money in the short term and delay it. And that comes down to political will. I wish I could solve that problem. I'm not sure. I'm an engineer.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the big thing that has helped push this forward a lot more is the amount of usage of the spectrum at this point. We were run out of sort of places that's easy to sort of displace someone, move them from here to there, because where they're using it before it made sense, but now it maybe makes sense to move them higher in the spectrum band so that, you know, mobile services can get in there, or satellite service can get in there. So we've run out of sort of the easy putts at this point, and if you don't have easy putts, then you have to start making hard decisions. So my hope is that there will be a renewed dialogue, and frankly, I thought the comment cycle for the harms claims threshold, I didn't see anyone sort of saying there's no way, no how. I saw a lot of people saying not in my band, but that's typical Washington. No one wants it in my band, and certainly not in anything that is in use right now.
And that
so
was
start with it going forward.
From the concept, the interference temperature when it first came out, there were a lot of people who said no way, no how.
Right, exactly. I thought it was much more moderated, and I wouldn't even call it opposition from my perspective.
I would add to the argument or the discussion that the commission does make in certain bands antenna standards a requirement, and those antenna standards are for receive antennas for the most part, and transmit antennas, but that's to, you know, suppress side lobes so that you can affect better coordination. We see that in the microwave bands a lot, and frankly, without that, it'd be very difficult to get stuff done. And so that's I guess a win-win. But that again, that goes back to kind of the early days. And what they did is they identified congested areas, and so you had to focus on the congested areas. That's kind of gone the way of the dodo bird. Yeah. But so there is some precedent at the commission for doing something on the receive end. Maybe just not all the way down the waveguide into the radio itself, but it has been done.
Steve, I'm sorry, Matt.
There's a couple of interesting things, maybe not directly related to receiver standards, but it's been going on with unlicensed. I saw some slides from a manufacturer. They're working on a software definable filter that basically it doesn't actually improve the receiver, but it greatly improves the signal coming into the receiver. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of potential for advancement on that side. And the other side is I know in our market we've seen great improvements in a short period of time in the capability of the equipment. And we run on about between a 4 and 7 year replacement cycle, where we basically replace everything in the network to get a new set of capabilities. And I think that, especially in a lot of the congested spectrum areas, that you're going to see kind of natural selection work its magic in getting less efficient, obsolete technology out of there for the most part.
Steve, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say on the noise temperature, I think the noise temperature issue was very different than some of the things that we're talking about now, where it's adjacent channel interference, right? The noise temperature was a proposal that you could just underlay low power devices across everything, which just does raise the noise floor. And it's all within your receiver, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And to the extent that a lot of the systems now are using spectrum more and more efficiently, and we're using it down to the noise floor to get the highest throughputs that we can. And yes, the systems can tolerate some noise, but it's at the expense of the customer experience. So you're getting slower data speeds, and the service is not as good. So there are impacts there that need to be taken into account when you're looking at something like that.
This morning, Mike Marcus mentioned, talked a little bit about the very old definition of harmful interference that the FCC, that's contained in the FCC's rules, and how unhelpful that is. And he suggested that the FCC should be interested in sort of updating it, or at least elaborating on that definition. What are your thoughts about that, and whether you think that is something that could be accomplished again without creating a firestorm?
I mean, I'm happy to go first. It was looked at a few years ago, as a matter of fact. I mean, under Chairman Martin, he started to kind of go down the path of, can I define harmful interference? And it really, when you start down that path, and we're engineers up here, it is so complex, number one, and two, it's so case by case. What's harmful interference to me may not be harmful interference to you, and vice versa. And what may be harmful interference to me today may not be tomorrow, and vice versa. So when you try and get it into, to put in lack of better terms, into sort of a lawyerly, very straight black and white sort of expression, it's going to be a very, very difficult endeavor, and there's going to be a lot of oxes gored when you try and get into that, especially when you have embedded bases. So, I mean, while I would welcome a discussion of, again, I don't think it's something that's easily done, and I'm not sure it's actually the right thing to do either, because it's just so hard and complicated, and I think it's so changeable over time. I mean, from where we were with cellular, with analog cellular to CDMA to LTE, what was harmful in analog is certainly not harmful to LTE. Right. I mean, it's just not. So that's what the problem I would have with sort of going into that, at least too much.
At least under the old definition, it's not.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
so that's
yeah.
I think that's one of the problems. It's getting more complicated about how to define that. And so while a rise in noise floor will negatively impact our system, does that rise to the level of harmful interference or not? And this is in our discussions with DoD as part of the sharing sharing and transition discussions that we've had around the AWS-3 spectrum. This was a huge point of debate that we would have with them, because while their systems are actually much simpler in that they're just trying to maintain a data link, and the link is kind of there or not, and it's going to perform to a certain level. But yet they would hold to a, still just a rise in noise level as a definition of interference, where we were, for those systems, I think it is more appropriate to look back at the old definition of, is the link operating or not, or are you going to drop it or not? But it was a difficult thing to visit with them.
Sure. One of the things we've done in the microwave world is we arrived at a definition, a mutually agreeable term for harmful interference back in the days when you were talking about analog, and it was, the noise in a 4 kHz channel, and if you go back to the old GT linkered stuff, 10F and all that, and so it wasn't codified. It didn't need to be codified. All the frequency coordinators sort of agreed amongst ourselves that that would be our definition of harmful interference for analog. Then we go to digital, and now the definition is a degradation of bit error rate from 10 neg 6 to 10 neg 3.
And that again is
it's a voluntary agreement, but now we've got the means within analysis tools to determine the aggregate issues. So we were talking about earlier this, in the thing this morning. Who's that last person coming in is the one that upsets the apple cart, so to speak. And so, there is that issue, but at least we have now some metric, at least in microwave, and I'm not sure it's done anywhere else like this, where we can at least determine, what is sort of a noise budget for a given link, and know that we're going to breach that budget by the next one coming in.
Let me ask you, what happens when someone does breach? Is it all gentleman's agreement or gentleman's agreement?
Well, it is a I won't use the term gentleman, but it is an agreement amongst frequency coordinators. Not that we're not gentlemen, but we have ladies too. So it's a mutual agreement among professionals, let's put it that way. That we will try not to do that, but there are people that get pressure to make it work, and so what will happen is then you'll have a link that succumbs, and usually it's the last one in, and that's the right, that's the interference rights that are given on primary spectrum. It's you have rights to interference protection, and so. But again, that's really all done among the frequency coordinators, and it's done a lot, not as a lot, but it's also done to some extent in the land mobile Part 90 frequency coordination process as well. That's not quite as much go and return, but it is coordinated, and they are certified by the commission. That doesn't happen in Part 101. So bottom line is that there is a mutually agreeable definition for harmful interference. So maybe it doesn't have to be a commission's definition. Maybe industry groups or standards bodies or whatever can arrive at it. The thing that Tom referred to, the bulletin, is a TIA bulletin, and that's kind of the Bible for microwave frequency coordination. So.
Well, and I think it works well when you have similar services. So fixed microwave is actually very easy. Point A, point B, they're not moving. It's very easy to sort of figure it out. Broadcast auxiliary service, they have the voluntary frequency coordinators. They do a great job of sort of managing disparate uses. I don't even know how the heck they do it because there's so many different things going on, but they figured out a way. But when you have one kind of service against another kind of service is when the fights really break out, and you're not going to get agreement there because there's no benefit to either side to get to some agreement, because the only benefit is, he gets to use more of my, more of my link margin. So there's not, there's an incentive problem there at some level when you have different parties that don't have the mutually agreed upon destruction that Matt talked about there.
Yeah, that was going to be my point. And you also have serial agreement. So if you're too nasty to me this time, I'll get you the next time. The other times there may just be one-off agreements where I don't have to deal with you later on. So that's another incentive to be kind of nice, because there's a possibility of retaliation if you're not.
This may be a good time to actually go to the audience for questions for the panel. Any questions? And I guess we should start with students to ask whether any of the students have any questions. Any non-students? Yes.
Thanks, Ari. I'll wait for the mic. I decided that the room needs a little waking up. I'd love for the panelists to, instead of talking about interference temperature, talk about what a harmful interference metric, if there was one, would mean to the process that, some of the discussions we've had already. I'd love to get people's feedback. How important is a harmful interference metric, if at all, in the end, or is it really a regulatory construct?
And is the point that you're making, if they could create a metric that would give something that the folks could actually negotiate around? It'd be some certainty And then if parties wanted to negotiate around that, they'd be free to negotiate around that. So, any?
I'll take the first shot. I mean, I would argue that a lot of the sort of technical rules that are in the book sort of do that. The out-of-band emission limits, the power limits, and basically, if you look at the FCC's rules, they always have a sort of throwaway line that says they reserve the right to attenuate you more if you cause problems. So I would argue that's their sort of harmful interference threshold. They have that set sort of standard in the rules in every single rule part that says, if we see something here that you could attenuate away, we may force you to attenuate additionally. So I actually think there is some of that flexibility already built in there from that perspective, at least. That's my thoughts on it.
Well, I'll pontificate on that as well and say that, that might work on a one-to-one situation, but the issue with aggregation, is really tough to mitigate. Because if you have all of us agreeing that, we will accept a certain level of harmful interference, but that excludes you. You're not part of the club, so to speak. You come on, and then how does that work? Because you cause all of us now to be interfered with, and so how do you do that equitably? And that may be a rhetorical question, but it is one that policy and engineering people are going to have to figure out if we're going to apportion term for harmful interference.
What about if you just set obligations based on who's the last person coming to the spectrum? I mean, there is a priority regime, and this may not be the best, may not be the most equitable way of going about doing it, but a rule that said that, it doesn't matter what type of great service you're providing, if you're just kind of the last person to the show, you've got to, afford a certain amount of protection to the folks who were there before you. And if you can't make that work, you can't make it work.
That would work, but I go to a point, that Matt was talking about, because the question I wanted to ask is, there's a lightly licensed band out there that's getting a lot of use, and it's the 3650 meg band, right above the 3.5 gig band. And, that is one where you have no first in time rights, so it's lightly licensed and you have no first in time rights, which is an interesting construct. And so I think I'd like to ask Matt, how's that working for you?
Well, it's interesting because that goes back to the last question about competing service types. Where the majority of my service area is inside of a 150-mile radius of Cheyenne, Wyoming, where EchoStar has a station, and they are afforded protection from having a 3650 deployed. So unless I want to go get a waiver, and that would require me to talk to a lawyer, and I don't like to do that when I don't have to, then I don't really deploy it. I've got another provider another competing provider who's deployed it. So I guess I can look at it from the point of view of it's worked out great for me because he's deploying there and I've got other spectrum to work with. But I have a little bit of anticipation of I'm a little concerned that the spectrum proceeding that's going on right now, the 35 up to 3650, is going to start to get bogged down in complexity and positioning and lobbying, stuff like that, and we're going to be locking up millions or billions of dollars worth of innovation if we don't get that out there and accessible and get devices in the hands of the companies and the users who can take advantage of it.
So I didn't mean to answer your question by deferring to Matt, just to see how I was going, but I think that the answer to your question is there may be certain services for which that's appropriate and applicable and others for which it won't work. And so speaking to the current 33.5 gig construct, you'll have 3 license tiers. And so trying to apportion harmful interference between the lower tier, the middle tier and the general access tier, I just don't, that's kind of, that's beyond my engineering capability at this point.
And I think the last in fixes it model, which does have some FCC precedent. It worked better when things were less complicated. I mean, now we're in the point of sharing at the nanosecond or microsecond level. Who gauges who was there first? And is someone going to get in there with a stopwatch and say, well, you were there, I was there 3 microseconds before you, so you have to fix it for me? I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but still, I mean, that's where we're headed at this point.
Or TV white space, for example, where that probably wouldn't work in TV white space, in similar constructs. So there are probably bands or services/bands where it makes perfect sense. Microwave's probably one of them because we have a handle on that. It's all database and all that, and maybe some land mobile perhaps because that's all databased as well. And others where it's just pretty a holy mess. So stay away from it.
So I've tried to. I'm sorry, Matt.
I was just going to make a quick comment about it's also a situation where I think the idea of having some information transparency there, where anybody that wants to go out and deploy would have ready access to see what's already out there, and that would give them a lot better idea. I know in my environment, a lot of times, if I'm looking to expand to another town, I look to see if there isn't somebody there already. And if they are, I'll do a little research on them. If they're fine and the customers are happy, I don't necessarily need to go there. And I would look at, a lot of these spectrum opportunities in kind of a similar way. Whereas I think especially a lot of bigger companies are more inclined to look at stuff on a nationwide basis and say, boom, we're going to blanket this with all of this without actually getting down at the granular level and looking at what's actually out there. So I think having some transparency as far as, the databases and a lot of these other constructs, while I'm not real excited about the complexity they're going to add to the products, the complexity and cost, I do like the idea of having some kind of at least base station registration in order to be able to kind of see what stuff is going to be out there at a point, because it would allow me to plan better and would allow everybody to kind of plan more effectively.
I'm going to ask Steve to respond to that. With the license, the services that have been licensed via auction, you don't have to tell the FCC where your base stations are located. In fact, you're given a license, a geographic area license that allows you to place them anywhere you want within that area. How would you feel, or how would T-Mobile feel about having to disclose the location of the
I think it's just a different situation in the spectrum, the licensed spectrum that we're operating in compared to an unlicensed band. We are the exclusive licensee in that area, so there's really no need to disclose that kind of information. And we're constantly changing where our base stations are, deploying new base stations, more and more giving consumers base stations for their, for their individual homes, things like that. So I think it's I guess I don't see the value of it for a service like ours, where you're trying to share. It's information that would be more valuable. So I think, and frankly, we're, as we're looking at, with some of the regulatory models that are being looked at, where there is more sharing or more shared use of spectrum, it's probably, makes sense to have those kinds of databases in those bands. But, again, I think it's it's not a one-size-fit-all approach that you have to disclose, or that makes sense to disclose that kind of information.
So I've been throwing out these ideas about how the government, whether it would be helpful if the government were to make more precise what it means by interference. It sounds like that you all agree that that would be a very difficult thing to accomplish. What short of that, what other things do you think the government could do to make, to make this issue or to address what we all know, what other things do you think the government could do to sort of improve the situation that you find yourselves in as operators? Anything else beyond we've talked about transparency, we've talked about more information, anything more? We talked about the possibility of an interference harm threshold.
I think that's a good, the interference harm threshold is a good, it's probably a really good one, because it does get harder and harder as we're squeezing in tighter and tighter with adjacent channel uses, guard bands go away, and that's probably one of the key ones. And I think it's, trying to ensure some coordination between users, and that's how, I know our guys are always dealing with interference problems out in the field, and a lot of times if it's another carrier or another, carriers, they've got to work with other carriers, and as we identify interference, we can work with other carriers to resolve them. So, making sure that lines of communication are open and facilitating that, I think, is helpful. And as we look at sharing or with different categories of users, like some of the bands where we are going to be sharing with government users, making sure that there are processes in place to facilitate those kinds of discussions, and that there are ways to work that out. And I think 90% of the time the users are able to work it out together, but then there's got to be some way to bring it back to a regulator to have some arbitration around resolving those problems.
Dale?
I wonder, we've drifted a little bit away. The prior panels have looked at unintended radiation sort of issues, and we've talked mostly here about intentional radiation. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts. Well, Lynn, I'd be curious. In the low VHF bands, my impression is, my anecdotal evidence is broadcasters, gee, that stuff's it's getting pretty noisy down there. And I mean, is there any measurements that have been made in the lower VHF bands and so forth that would actually document whether things that some of the devices that we've talked about have actually resulted in greater noise, separating out the interference for a second?
Well, certainly low VHF is one of those wonderful examples where the world has been turned upside down, certainly for broadcasting. Channels 2 through 6 were the so-called beachfront property for decades, and that's where everyone wanted to be, or thought they wanted to be, and then they found out that in the digital world, it wasn't so good. In fact, it was worse than not so good. It was awful. Have there been measurements made that actually document how bad the reception of low VHF is? I don't think there have been a lot, and there certainly haven't been enough. But everything is, it's not just the man-made noise that's down there. Everything is against you. You have the habits of people, and the habits of people have changed drastically for that particular use case of television. They used to think nothing of hiring someone or themselves going up on the roof of their house and putting on a couple or 3 meter antenna on the top of their house that was well matched to the long wavelengths of low VHF. And they don't do that anymore. So they want to use indoor antennas that are much less efficient in the VHF range. But even worse than that, you're now putting the antenna very close to where these sources of noise are. All those appliances and the vacuum cleaners and all the electronic devices that spray unwanted emissions around a house are now within feet, or in some cases inches, for the naive consumer, of the antenna for the receiver. And meanwhile, we're becoming a mobile society, and no one wants to carry around a big antenna with them, with their cell phone that's about the size of a pack of cards and uses an embedded antenna. So for a lot of reasons, the low VHF is kind of the new Siberia for television. And yet we have a process where via incentive auctions, there's going to be a reallocation of UHF, and where are those broadcasters who don't want to participate in the auction? I'm sorry, did I misspeak? Where are they going to go? They're being incentivized to actually go back to low VHF, where there's too much noise, the wrong antenna, people don't like it, and it's not mobile. So how you solve that problem is not just a question of, it's an aggregated problem that of which we know man-made noise is an issue, and noise in the house, but it's not the only problem. So I'm not sure that while it would be helpful to have those tests and to understand and to be able to document and put on a nice Cartesian coordinate curve what the rise of noise level is, I'm not sure that offers a real solution for that problem for television reception.
We did make measurements. It wasn't in VHF, it was in UHF. We do troubleshoot measurements a lot, as I've said earlier, and we got called to do a troubleshoot in the VHF, or the WMTS band, which is in VHF, UHF is 608 to 614 megahertz, and identified the problem that you talked about earlier, which was fluorescent lights. And the issue is especially pernicious for fluorescent lights because they also use switching power supplies for dimmers. And so we identified the problem, not because we were able to identify noise coming out of it, but when we shut the lights off, the interference went away. Sometimes that's all it takes, you know. You go in there with a $30,000 spectrum analyzer and shut the lights off and the interference goes away. But the bigger issue is, what do you do about it? You know, because this was a very well-known lighting company that put these in, and it was, when the lights went on, the WMTS system went down. And actually, I don't know if it was WMTS. It could have been in one of the other bands operating unlicensed, but nonetheless, you know, the entire telemetry went down. And the situation you've got is, you've got a transmitter in the wall that's using a huge distributed antenna network. So we've done lots of that. Baby monitors have been shut off by virtue of these what are they? The things that keep people from taking things out of the hospital. There's these, you know, you walk out, it's like when you walk out.
Field disturbance.
Field disturbance stuff, yeah. So baby monitors have been shut off, and so, you know, that's just an example of some of the problems. I mean, it's fascinating when you hear these guys talk about them, but I mean, I wouldn't want to be hooked up to a monitoring device. Fire light goes off, so. But there's a lot of that stuff that's been documented and all across all the spectrum we're talking about. So.
It's hard to, as an academic, to find all that and collect all. I'm looking at Pierre, because we've been trying to understand this better, and it really is difficult to...
We can talk, because, I mean, some of that stuff is just fascinating. I mean, like I said, the one I said this morning about the beer cooler is, I think, you know, we had a panel this morning.
You have to clarify that.
Yeah, and there was...
I volunteer.
Yeah, beer at 8 in the morning. You know, we did a little panel enforcement, or a little roundtable enforcement, and so we went around the table, and Pierre was asking what were we reading, and I said, well, I was reading the local news, and one of the things that came out on it was, and I have to get my thing out to read it specifically, but in Australia, somebody with a beer cooler took down one of Telstra's base stations. And so the issue was, the beer cooler wasn't just a passive, you know, playmate beer cooler. It was one that had a motor in it, and apparently the motor was generating spurious noise that took down a base station. I mean, it's not funny that, you know, well, yeah, it is. I guess I'm not Telstra, so I don't have to deal with it. It certainly is, you know, humorous after the fact, but that's the kind of thing, you know, that you read about that and you just think, wow. And, you know, and again, it's all documented. Spurious noise is a major problem. And, you know, that was, again, it was a DC motor, and DC motors have brushes, and those generate impulse noise, and so, you know, voila. So we've got a database, not databases, but, you know, our archives are full of those types of things.
So I think on that note, I think we've run out of time here. So I want to, could you please all thank our panelists and
Thank you to the panel. We've got a 15-minute break. Reconvene at 4 p.m.